The small green notebook was hidden inside the breast pocket of my old wool coat, the one hanging at the very back of the closet behind Frank's golf jackets. I'd bought the notebook with quarters I'd collected from the bottom of my purse over 6 weeks, paid for it at the dollar store on Kerr Street while Frank waited in the car with the engine running, calling it a waste of time to go in for one item. I'd slipped it into my coat pocket when I got back to the car and told him I'd found a pen I liked. He didn't ask to see it. He never thought I was capable of anything requiring that much foresight. That notebook held everything: account numbers I'd memorized from old statements, the address on Rebecca Street where I needed to go on Thursdays, a phone number written in pencil so faint it would look like a smudge to anyone else, and a list, 7 items long, each one crossed off except the last 2. The last line read, "Thursday, Donna, don't look back." It started the way these things always do, quietly and with the best of intentions, which is what makes it so hard to name later. Frank retired from his engineering firm 3 years ago, and I thought it would mean we'd finally have time together. We'd been married 38 years, raised 2 children in our house in Oakville, and for most of those years he'd worked long hours and traveled for projects in Calgary and Edmonton, and once, for 3 months, up near Sudbury. I'd done everything else. Raised our son and daughter, taught grade 4 at Falgarwood Public School for 26 years, managed the house, the groceries, the dentist appointments, the social calendar. I was used to running things. What I wasn't prepared for was that retirement would give Frank the time and the inclination to run me. It began with the finances. He'd always managed the investments and the taxes, which I'd been grateful for because I found spreadsheets tedious and he was genuinely good at it. But 3 months into his retirement, he called me to the kitchen table one Sunday morning and laid out a new system. He'd combined our checking accounts into a single joint account, which sounded reasonable enough until he explained that he'd also changed the online banking password, for security, he said. He'd had a call from someone claiming to be from RBC and he didn't want us to be vulnerable. He'd look after the online access from now on. I just needed to tell him what I needed and he'd transfer it. I should have said something then. I know that now. But I'd been conditioned by decades of telling myself he was better at this than I was, and so I nodded and refilled his coffee and went back to reading my book. My CPP and OAS deposits had always gone into my personal account. I'd kept it for 30 years, the same account I'd opened when I got my first teaching salary. Within 2 months of his retirement, Frank had arranged for both deposits to go into the joint account instead. He told the bank I'd authorized it. I hadn't signed anything I could point to, but I'd initialed some paperwork he'd slid across to me one evening while I was watching the news, and I hadn't read it carefully enough. I was 63 years old, and I hadn't read my own financial paperwork carefully enough. That is the thing about this kind of control. It uses your own trust as the lock on the door. He gave me $200 every 2 weeks for groceries and personal expenses. If I needed more, I had to ask. The asking was the worst part. Not because he always said no, but because of how he said yes. A birthday card from my friend Carol. He stood in the kitchen while I wrote the grocery list and watched me add it. What does a card cost now? $12? Just text her. Margaret. Nobody actually wants a card. They're just paper. I bought the card anyway, but I sat with the guilt of it for 2 days. New reading glasses. My prescription had changed and I was getting headaches. He pulled up the receipt on his phone from the last pair I'd bought and asked why this new prescription cost $40 more. I explained that my astigmatism had worsened. He sighed the sigh of a man who suspects he is being managed and made me feel that I had invented the astigmatism to inconvenience him. My Tuesday morning book club at the Oakville Public Library, which I had attended for 9 years. Free, completely free, just the time and the bus fare because Frank had started driving me everywhere and taking the car. Those women just gossip, Margaret. You come home in a mood every time. I stopped going in December. I told myself it was the cold. The cold became February, and February became spring, and I had been to book club 3 times in 5 months and had canceled on Carol twice for lunch because I couldn't justify the expense without asking, and the asking required an explanation, and the explanations had started to feel like auditions for a role I kept failing. Frank, in that same period, had joined a golf club in Burlington. He went every Thursday morning and stayed for lunch after. He had a standing dinner with his engineering friends the first Wednesday of every month at a steakhouse in Mississauga. He bought himself a new set of Callaway irons in April without mentioning it until they arrived at the door. When I pointed out that he hadn't told me, he said he didn't realize he needed my permission to spend money he'd earned. I didn't say that my CPP and my OAS were also money I had earned. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. I'd stopped calling my daughter Rachel in Halifax regularly. It wasn't that Frank had taken my phone. He hadn't, but he monitored the phone bill on the joint account, and he commented whenever I called long distance. "That's 40 minutes to Halifax, Margaret. Doesn't she have a plan? Can't you use the computer?" And I could, but the computer was in the office where he spent most of his day, and calling my daughter with him sitting 10 feet away made every conversation feel like a performance. So I called less. And Rachel, sensing something she couldn't name, called less too. The silence between us grew the way silence does, without anyone deciding to grow it. The breaking point was a Tuesday morning in January. I had a prescription for amlodipine, the blood pressure medication I'd been taking for 6 years. I'd forgotten to pick it up before the holidays, and I'd stretched my last pills by splitting them, which my doctor had told me not to do. I had $160 to last me until Frank's next transfer, and the prescription was $72 at the Shoppers Drug Mart on Lakeshore Road. I stood at the pharmacy counter and counted the bills in my wallet. I did it twice. I had not done grocery shopping yet. I needed bread, milk, the medications, and Frank had mentioned wanting pork tenderloin for dinner. I stood there with my wallet open and did the arithmetic that women in my situation do, the cold and shameful arithmetic of choosing between your health and your husband's dinner, and I felt something crack open in my chest. The pharmacist was a woman about 40, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses she wore on top of her head. Her name tag said Sunita. She watched me count and recount the bills, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she came around to the side of the counter and lowered her voice. "Are you all right?" I said I was fine. I was very used to saying I was fine. She looked at my hands. I didn't realize until she looked that they were shaking. She said she'd be back in a moment. She went to the back and returned with a small card, white with blue lettering, Halton Women's Place. A phone number and a note in small print that said services for all women, including seniors. She pressed it into my hand and said they had helped people she knew. That was all she said. She didn't make it into a big thing. I think if she'd made it into a big thing, I would have left. I paid for the medication and took the bus home. Frank had the car for something he'd told me about that morning, and I hadn't retained because I'd been thinking about the prescription. I sat on the bus with the card in my coat pocket and looked out the window at the frozen lake and thought about Sunita's face, the way she'd looked at my hands, like she recognized something. I hid the card inside my old green coat, the one from before Frank retired that I never wore anymore because he'd bought me a new one and said the green one looked dated. I put it in the breast pocket and hung the coat at the back of the closet. That night, while Frank slept, I lay in the dark and thought about my mother. She'd died 12 years ago, still married to my father, a man who'd never raised his voice in his life and who had nonetheless managed to make her world very small. I used to wonder if she'd been happy. I used to think that was a separate question from whether she'd been free. The following Thursday, while Frank was at golf, I walked to the library on Lakeshore and used one of the public computers to look up Halton Women's Place. I found their address and their hours. I found information I hadn't known existed. That financial abuse was a recognized form of domestic abuse under the Ontario Domestic Violence Action Plan. That coercive control, the systematic limitation of a person's freedom, was recognized in Canadian law. That there were advocates whose entire job was to help people in exactly the situation I was trying to convince myself I wasn't in. I sat in the library for a long time after reading those pages. The words domestic abuse sat on the screen in front of me, and I argued with them in my head. He'd never hit me. He'd never called me names. Not really. He was just particular. Just careful with money. Just particular. But the words stayed where they were and didn't argue back. I took the bus to Rebecca Street the following Thursday. The center was in a house that had been converted, warm inside and painted in yellows and sage greens. A woman at the front desk smiled when I came in and didn't make me explain myself before she'd offered me tea. The advocate I met with was named Louise. She was 52, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of calm that comes from having heard everything. I started talking and couldn't stop. 30 minutes of everything I'd been calling normal, everything I'd been calling just the way he is, everything I'd been comparing to hitting and saying at least it wasn't that. Louise, let me finish. She didn't look shocked, and she didn't look pitying, which were the two things I'd been most afraid of. She said, "What you're describing has a name. Financial abuse and coercive control are not less serious because they don't leave visible marks. What's happening to you is real, and it's not your fault, and you have options." I started to say I couldn't leave. I didn't have access to money. My name was technically on the joint account, but I couldn't get to it without him knowing. My house was in both our names, but I'd have nowhere to go. Louise said, "Let's talk about what's possible before we talk about what isn't." Over the next 10 weeks, I went to Rebecca Street every Thursday while Frank was at golf. Louise connected me with a family law lawyer named Karen Osei who worked through a legal aid clinic in Burlington. Karen explained the Ontario Family Law Act to me in terms I could follow. Under the Act, I had the right to equalization of net family property, which meant I was entitled to half the increase in value of our shared assets over the course of the marriage. Our house, the RRSPs, the TFSAs, the savings account, the car, half. Karen said that word like it had weight, which it did. She also told me the first thing I needed to do was get my own bank account at a different institution from RBC where Frank held everything. She told me to go to TD and open a personal account in my name only, and then to contact Service Canada and redirect my CPP and OAS deposits to the new account. This I could do myself, Karen said, through my own My Service Canada account online. The deposits were mine. They had always been mine. The redirection required only my authorization, not Frank's. I hadn't known that. I had been living as though I had no rights over my own pension for 2 years, and I had not known that. I went to the TD branch on Trafalgar Road on a Wednesday afternoon when Frank was watching his programs. I told him I was going to pick up a prescription. I opened an account and walked out with a bank card I hid in the green coat pocket, in the breast pocket where I kept the notebook, behind the card from Sunita and the card from Louise. The next Thursday at the library, I logged into My Service Canada and redirected both deposits to my TD account. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. The harder part was the documents. Frank kept our important papers in a fireproof box in the basement storage room, and the box had a combination lock. I didn't know the combination. I spent 3 Thursdays trying combinations. His birthday, my birthday, our anniversary, the year we bought the house, nothing. On the 4th Thursday, I found it by accident. He'd written it inside the cover of his address book, which he kept on his desk, because Frank was the kind of man who considered himself too logical to be sentimental about security. The combination was the year his father had died. I hadn't expected sentiment to be where he hid things. I photographed everything with my phone and emailed the images to an account I'd created at the library using a name that wasn't mine. And then I printed the most important ones at the FedEx store 2 blocks from Trafalgar. My birth certificate, my SIN card, our marriage certificate, 3 months of joint bank statements, the deed to the house, and the RRSP statements from December. The woman at the FedEx counter asked if I needed help with the printer, and I said no thank you in a voice that sounded like someone else's. I returned the originals to the box and reset the lock with shaking hands and stood in the basement for a few minutes, breathing until I could walk upstairs normally. Louise had connected me with a women's transition house in Hamilton called Interval House. A woman named Barbara ran the residential program. She had a small apartment available, a bedroom, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a window looking out at a snow-covered backyard. $320 a week, utilities included, and Barbara would accept my first 2 weeks from the fund she ran for women who arrived with nothing. "You'll pay it back when you can," she said. "Or you'll pass it along to the next woman who needs it. That's how it works here." The hardest thing I did in those 10 weeks was buy the prepaid phone. I bought it at a Walmart in Burlington on a Thursday, paying cash I'd been saving in the green coat pocket for 6 weeks, folded into the notebook's back pages. $50 for a basic flip phone and a prepaid card. I brought it home in my purse inside a grocery bag and hid it in the coat pocket with everything else. I'd planned to use it for emergencies in case Frank took my regular phone before I could get away. But on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks before I planned to leave, I took the coat from the closet while Frank was in the shower. I sat in the bedroom with the door shut and I called Rachel. She picked up on the third ring. "Mom?" her voice, surprised and a little worried. I hadn't called her personal number from an unknown number before. I said, "Rachel, it's me. I'm using a different phone. I can't explain right now, but I need you to know that I love you and I'm going to be all right and I'll explain everything soon. Can you just tell me you know that?" There was a pause. Then she said, very carefully, "Mom, are you safe right now?" I said, "Yes, I am safe right now. I am working on being safe permanently." She cried. I hadn't expected that. She told me she'd been worried for 2 years, that she'd tried to call and he'd always answered and said I was resting, that she'd sent cards she wasn't sure I'd received. I hadn't received them. I thought she was pulling away from me. The realization that I'd spent 2 years grieving a distance that Frank had manufactured between us was the closest I came, in those 10 weeks, to falling apart entirely. I told her I would call her again soon from a better place. She said, "Mom, whatever is happening, I am on the next flight if you need me. Remember that." I put the phone back in the coat pocket and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let myself feel everything I'd been not feeling for 3 years. We chose a Thursday. Frank's golf started at 9. He was usually gone by 8:30 and back no earlier than 1, sometimes as late than 2 if he stayed for lunch with his friends at the club, which he almost always did. That gave me 4.5 hours minimum. My neighbor Donna had known for 3 weeks. I'd told her on a Tuesday afternoon when she came over for coffee, sitting at my kitchen table with Frank out in the house quiet, and I'd watched her face move through shock and then grief and then something hard and practical as she asked what she could do. Donna was 68, widowed, with a car and no obligations on Thursday mornings. She said, "You tell me what time and I'll be outside." The night before I left, I lay next to Frank in the bed we'd shared for 38 years, listening to him breathe in the deep, even way he slept, the way he'd always slept, unbothered by anything, and I felt very calm. Not numb, not resigned, but genuinely calm. The way you feel when you've finally made a decision you've been circling for years, and the deciding is done. I made him breakfast in the morning, oatmeal with brown sugar the way he liked it, and coffee from the drip machine. He read the news on his iPad and mentioned the cold front coming through from Manitoba. He said the course might be icy by the afternoon. He did not say goodbye when he left. He picked up his keys from the hook by the door and walked out, and the door clicked shut behind him, and I stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway. I waited 15 minutes. Then I got the green coat from the closet. The suitcase was already packed. I'd done it slowly over 3 weeks, a blouse at a time, sliding things into the bag I'd stored behind the holiday boxes in the basement. 2 pairs of jeans, 4 blouses, a good wool sweater, underwear, socks, my winter boots, my blood pressure medication, the photographs from my mother's albums that I'd been slowly rescanning onto a USB drive, my grandmother's pearl earrings that I'd kept in a tea tin at the back of my jewelry drawer for 20 years, my teaching certificate, my professional development records from 26 years in the classroom. All of it fit into one rolling bag with room to spare. I walked through the house once, the kitchen where I'd cooked 38 years of dinners, the living room where I'd stopped turning on the programs I liked because Frank found them stupid, the office where I'd stopped sitting because it made him ask what I was doing on the computer, the bedroom where I'd spent 2 years lying awake trying to figure out if what was happening to me was real. I didn't take anything off the walls. I didn't leave a note. Karen had been very clear about that. Don't explain yourself. Don't give him a document to reframe. Just go. Donna was in the driveway at 9:15, her Subaru running, a travel mug of Tim's on the console for me. She put my bag in the trunk without a word, and we drove down the street and turned onto Lakeshore, and I watched Oakville disappear behind me in the side mirror, and I thought, this is what the end of a life chapter looks like. Not dramatic. Just a gray January morning, and a neighbor's car and a cup of coffee going cold in your hands. Interval House was on a residential street in Hamilton that I'd driven past dozens of times without ever knowing what was inside. Barbara met us at the door. She showed me to the small apartment on the 2nd floor, the one with the window over the backyard. There was a twin bed with a floral quilt and a small bookshelf someone had filled with paperbacks. A kettle on the counter. A bathroom that was entirely mine. Barbara said, "There are 4 other women in the building right now. We eat together in the common room at 6 if you want company, or you eat in your room, Whatever you need, you're safe here." After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed and cried for a long time. Not from fear or grief, but from the strange physical sensation of safety, of being somewhere Frank did not know about, somewhere he could not account for me, and the feeling was so unfamiliar after 3 years that my body had to process it like a new climate. Frank called my regular phone 47 times. I'd left it on the kitchen counter, which Karen had suggested. He called Donna, who told him she hadn't seen me. He called the non-emergency police line and told them his wife of 38 years had disappeared and might be confused, might not be in her right mind, which is the phrase men like Frank reach for when a woman finally acts in her own interest. The officer he spoke to asked if she'd left any indication she was in danger. Frank said he didn't understand. She was fine. Everything was fine. Something had clearly happened to her. The officer noted that she was a legal adult who had not indicated distress and that no crime had been committed. Karen called me that afternoon on the prepaid phone. She'd been served notice that Frank had contacted her office. She said, "He's going to deny everything. He always does." "We have the documents, Margaret. We have 3 months of statements showing your deposits going into his account while you had no independent access. We have the records of what he spent versus what you had access to. Let him deny it." Rachel was on a flight from Halifax by Thursday evening. She'd booked it the moment I called her from the prepaid phone to give her Barbara's address and tell her I was safe. She arrived on Friday morning with her rolling bag and her eyes red from the flight, and she held me in the hallway outside my small apartment for a long time without saying anything. When she finally spoke, she said, "I should have come sooner. I didn't know how bad it was." I said, "I didn't know either." That was the truest thing I said in those first few days. We sat in the common room at Interval House and drank tea, and Rachel told me about her life in Halifax. The things I'd missed, the promotion at the hospital where she worked, the kitchen renovation she'd done herself, a man named David she'd been seeing for a year. I told her about the green coat, about Sunita at the shopper's counter, about Louise and Karen and Donna and Barbara, about the prepaid phone and the 10 weeks of Thursdays. Rachel listened and cried and laughed in the places that required laughing, and by the time Barbara knocked to say dinner was ready in the common room, we had filled in 5 years of silence. The separation process took 8 months. Frank hired a lawyer and contested everything. He claimed I had left voluntarily and abandoned the marriage. He claimed I had been influenced by the advocates at Interval House, who he called, in one of his letters to Karen, extremist organizations. He argued that the financial arrangements had been mutual decisions made for tax efficiency. He said I had agreed to everything. Karen had the bank records. She had the statements showing that my CPP and OAS, combined nearly $1,100 a month, had been flowing into an account I couldn't access online for 22 months. She had Frank's credit card records showing $1,800 a month in personal spending during the period he'd given me $200 every 2 weeks. She had my testimony, Louise's professional assessment, and a written statement from Rachel about intercepted correspondence. The judge was a man in his 60s who had clearly heard every version of this argument before. He listened to Frank's lawyer characterize me as confused and easily influenced. He looked at the bank records. He did not look confused. Under the Ontario Family Law Act, I received equalization of net family property, half the increase in value of our house, which we'd bought in 1997 and which had appreciated substantially, half the RRSPs, half the TFSAs. My share came to just over $400,000, plus spousal support of $2,200 a month until my CPP and OAS were fully redirected and sufficient. I got the car, which Frank had registered in both names when I pressed the point, or Karen did. The day Karen called to tell me the order had been signed, I was sitting in the common room at Interval House, having coffee with a woman named Brenda, who had arrived 2 weeks earlier and was still in the stage where everything felt impossible. I told her I had some good news. She asked if I was leaving the house. I said, yes, soon. She looked frightened. I told her that wasn't a thing to be frightened of, that the leaving was the beginning, not the end. I found an apartment in Hamilton, on James Street South, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor with a balcony and a view of the escarpment. I furnished it slowly, the way you do when everything you're choosing is yours. I kept the green coat. I went back to book club, a different one, at the Hamilton Public Library, because starting fresh felt better than returning. I had coffee with Donna every other Tuesday. Rachel flew out from Halifax for a long weekend in June, and we drove up to Blue Mountain and walked the trails and ate dinner at a place on the village square and stayed up until midnight talking. David came with her in August and turned out to be quieter than I'd expected and kinder in the way that quiet people often are. In September, I started volunteering at Interval House. I sit with the new women in the early days, the ones who aren't sure yet whether what happened to them was real, the ones who are still arguing with themselves about whether they're overreacting, whether it was really that bad, whether someone who never raised his voice can really be called what he is. I make tea, which is something I have always been able to do. I let them talk. I tell them, when they're ready to hear it, that what they're describing has a name, that they're not overreacting, that there is a way out and people who will help them find it. The green coat still hangs in my closet. The notebook is still in the breast pocket, mostly full now, all 7 items crossed off. I take the coat out sometimes and hold it, not with sadness but with something like respect. That coat was the only place in my house, for 3 years, that Frank couldn't reach, the only space that was entirely mine. There's a phrase I read on the wall at Interval House, a small framed print in the common room. It's never too late to reclaim your own name. I read it the first day and I've thought about it most days since. Not because it's new to me, but because I spent 38 years forgetting it was true. I'm 64 years old. I have a balcony with a view of the escarpment. I have a daughter who calls me every Sunday from Halifax on a plan that has unlimited long distance. I have a book club and a neighbor who knows where I am. I have a bank account with my name on it, only my name, with a password only I know, with deposits that are mine. I have everything that was always mine. It just took me a while to remember I was allowed to take it back.